Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, Chapter 7, Halacha 5. And Halacha 5 is going to very much parallel Chapter 7, Halacha 1. In the case of Chapter 7, Halacha 1, just to recap, that's going to be a case where you don't believe that there's Breira, and you're going to be separating Demai. You're going to be starting this process so that you can eat some food on Shabbat. Now, the case is going to be like you're invited to a wedding party, and you're going to be starting the tithing process for food that you bought in advance. It says over there that you should be trying to get it from the same supplier. That way it has the same tithing status. We remember that you can't tithe one set of Demai on behalf of another set of Demai because they might not be equal. Why? Because this set of Demai might have had all of the tithes taken, this set of Demai might have had some of the tithes taken, and this set of Demai might have had none of the tithes taken. And we can't tithe dissimilar things on behalf of one another. So in the case of Halacha 1, that was going to be a case where everybody would agree about it, and it works in a case where you don't believe that there's Breira, which portion you already started. You're not doing anything new. Halacha 5 is going to be the parallel now where you're talking about actual Tevel. And in the case of Halacha 1, you were doing it with Demai. And over here, this is going to be the case of doing it where you do believe in Breira. That's going to be part of the difference. Now, the Mishnah has two cases where you're going to make this advanced Maestros declaration that's going to allow you to eat this produce on Shabbat. One is going to be with Tevel, and one is going to be with Demai. Again, the difference here is that you're holding a worldview that there is Breira. So Breira, as we know, is a retroactive declaration that when you finish the process of something, what you started is as if the whole process was already that way. So if this were going to be a case of Breira, like what we saw in Chapter 7, Halacha 4 with Rabbi Meir's position, where you're saying, okay, I'm going to start tithing this with a mental designation, then I'm going to eat the produce over the Shabbat, and then I'm going to physically separate out the tithes at the end of Shabbat after Motzei Shabbos. That is not going to be the Halacha L'maisa, but that's just an example, and according to Rabbi Meir's view of Breira, that's going to be a case where the Breira that you had retroactively at the start just before Shabbat would always have been tithed. That's how it works. So the Mishnah says if one had 100 figs of Tevel in his house, but on the eve of Shabbat he was away in the house of study or in the field, and he was concerned that he would not have time to separate the tithes before Shabbat. So again, you have to separate these tithes for definite Tevel when there's 2 stars out, or before 2 stars out. In the case of Demai, you can do it when there's 2 stars out, but in the case of Tevel, there has to at least be 1 star, and if there's 2, you're not allowed to do it. So we're really trying to create a position that's really just up in front of when you can't make the tithe anymore. And the Mishnah is talking about a case where the person's figs are definite Tevel, and he has to separate out Truma Gedola. There's another opinion, by the way, that this is also what the Tosafot holds, that this is talking about a case of Demai. That is not talking about a case of Tevel, and we'll get into that in a minute. But he should say the following. He should say, the 2 figs that I will eventually separate from the pile are hereby designated as Truma. The 10 additional figs that I will eventually separate are designated as Meiser Rishon, and the 9 additional figs that I will eventually separate are designated as Meiser Sheni. And after you make this stipulation, he's allowed to eat the figs on Shabbat. Again, this relies on Breira. Now, more precisely, it says the 9 figs. It's actually going to come out to 9.8 figs for Meiser Rishon, and then the Meiser Sheni is going to be 8.82, but the Mishnah here we see is rounding it off. And the person is not designating Trumas Meiser because we are dealing with definite Tevel, not Demai. And he has to separate the Meiser Rishon, give it to a Levi, who's going to then take the tithe out for the Trumas Meiser, which he's going to keep for himself. So, as we were mentioning that we're talking about whether it's going to be definite Tevel in this Mishnah or not, the Mishnah is going with the opinion that it's Breira. And the Rambam's pointing out about this in his commentary on the Mishnah, that this Mishnah is ruling that Breira can even be reliable in a case of biblical law, something that's going to be Doraita. We know that Doraita, you have to tithe. That's a Doraita obligation. Well, would Breira work for something that's Doraita, or is it going to be working just in a case of something D'Rabbanan? That's new information, and the Rambam comments about this Mishnah that it's showing that Breira could work in a case of something that's going to be rabbinic. Now, you can see, according to the Halacha, though, that in the Mishnah's case, the person has to separate the tithes from the remaining produce on Shabbat before he eats any of the produce. And this is permitted because once he verbally designates the tithes before the Shabbos, all he does on Shabbat is go and identify the pre-designated portion. And that is very similar to what we saw with how you're going to do it if you're assuming that there's no Breira. And basically over there in chapter 7, Halacha 1, you're basically going to be starting this process on Demai and going to be pointing to it and saying, okay, I've identified it. The problem and the difference between chapter 7, Halacha 1 and chapter 7, Halacha 5 is going to be that if you're holding that there's no Breira, you're going to be saying that I'm not actually physically separating it on Shabbat. That would be a problem because I don't believe in Breira. All I'm doing is identifying it. And then what you would say about the case, if you don't believe in Breira, you would say that this you can only do on Demai because it's rabbinic, and you can't do this on something that's Doraita. You can't just go identify the missing portion that you pre-designated before Shabbat. You can't go do that for something that's Doraita. That's going to be the idea. The idea is that in the case, if you don't believe there's Breira, you're going to say that, yes, okay, you can just identify it. Again, you're not picking it out. You're just identifying the leftover portion, and you can do that under the Rabbanan thing. That's why it works in Demai. But they'd be saying that, look, we're talking about it in the case of Demai. This is not written about this in the case of Tevel. In Tevel, that's Doraita. You can't do that. Now, over here, there's an opinion that a person, everybody agrees that a person's not physically allowed to separate tithes on Shabbat. Everybody agrees about that. And over here, because he's tithing more than he needs to eat on Shabbat itself, that would be part of the issue in this Gemara, right? So if you're tithing just what you need, all you're doing is you're just identifying it. But if you're going to be taking out more than you need, now you have a problem. And when you're dealing with definite Tevel, one is allowed to separate the tithes on Shabbat on the basis of a pre-Shabbos stipulation, and only for food that he will eat on Shabbat, and only if you're going to believe that there's Breira. But in the case where it's Demai, somebody, and by the way, the second clause of this Mishnah deals with Demai, someone who makes this pre-Shabbos stipulation is allowed to separate the tithes on Shabbat for more produce than he needs. And again, that's going to be different than chapter 7 Halacha 1. In chapter 7 Halacha 1, he's just making this designation on Demai for just what he needs to eat for this wedding party. Over here, the new information that we're getting on the Demai portion in chapter 7 Halacha 5, the new information that we get is that on this rabbinic tithe on the Demai, all we're doing, we're now just taking out the portion that we need for ourselves, and we're also taking out extra. Now, you wouldn't be able to do that if it's going to be Tevel and if it's going to be Doraita, but because this is going to be a Demai issue, what this is trying to argue is that you're going to be able to go ahead and make this advance tithe where you're going to go and you're going to do the extra portion for more than what you need. You can even do that on Shabbat. Now, this stipulation in this clause of the Mishnah is going to resort to a post-Shabbos separation of tithes. And that's also going to be valid only if you're going to believe in Breira. But the Mishnah is going to be ruling it halachically valid. And many Rishonim, by the way, Rambam doesn't hold this, but many Rishonim are going to be saying that the figs are subject to tithing only rabbinically, and because only grain, wine, and oil are going to be required to tithing biblically. That gets into another case about whether you're going to read on tithes grain, wine, and oil as being a hekish, like what the Rambam says, that it applies to lots of other kinds of foods like the figs. Or if you're going to read it as literal and say that, no, the list is just grain, wine, and oil, and it's limited to those things, and it's not a hekish trying to expand it out to other things. So there's a few things going on over here, and I want to look at this with the Vilna Goan. The Vilna Goan is saying that that the Yerushalmi's version of this Mishnah, where it's saying the word tomorrow, it's part of the stipulation, and the ruling is not based on Breira. And the Vilna Goan notes that, according to the Bavli version of the Mishnah, that does not contain the word tomorrow, this ruling is based on Breira. So the Vilna Goan does not indicate which passage in the Bavli contains this inference, but basically the Vilna Goan is pointing out that there's a Bavli version that refers to this Mishnah that does not use the word tomorrow, whereas this Yerushalmi is using the word tomorrow. And he's saying that one version with tomorrow is going to be a case where you're talking about doing this not based on Breira, like what we talked about in chapter 7, halacha 1. And when you're not using the word tomorrow, you're doing it where you do believe that there is Breira. So there's a lot going on here. So now we have the second case. And it says, if the figs are Demai, but he was away and unable to tie them, then before the Shabbos he should say the following: that one fig I will separate tomorrow is hereby designated as Meiser Rishon, and let the rest of the Meiser, in other words, the 9 figs that are next to it, be the Meiser. And he then says, the fig that I made into Meiser Rishon first is hereby made into Trumas Meiser for the Meiser Rishon. And he continues, and the Meiser Sheni for these 100 figs are hereby designated in the northern side or in the southern side, and is hereby deconsecrated upon the coins I set aside for this purpose. And basically, after you make this declaration before the Shabbat, he's going to be allowed on Shabbat to separate one fig that's set aside as a Truma Meiser and eat from the rest of the figs. Now, again, there's several differences between this stipulation and the case that we're talking about, where you're talking about definite Tevel. They're not the same declaration. This is not a case of, oh, this is talking about Tevel and here's the declaration, and I'm using the same declaration on Demai, and it's not the case. They're differences. So in the first clause, we're talking about Tevel, we're going to be dealing with Demai, and it's not necessary to separate Truma Gedola. And in the second part of the clause over here, we're talking about Demai. On the first part that you're talking about definite Tevel, you do have to separate out Truma Gedola. And over here, in talking about the first clause of the Demai, it's not saying that you're taking out 2%, but in the first part of the Mishnah it is. Another difference is that since the Meiser Rishon of Demai is not given to the Levi, it is necessary for the owner himself to separate the Truma Meiser. So in the case of definite Tevel, he gives it to a Levi. In the case of separating out Truma Meiser from Demai, maybe the Truma Meiser was already separated by the supplier of this, or the farmer. And so then a Levi already got it. And in a court of law, a Levi wouldn't be able to prove that this specific portion was already given to a Levi or not. And we know that you don't do double tithing. So over here, the person's going to be allowed to keep it. So another difference between the first part of the Mishnah and this part is that in the case of Demai, the owner does not need to physically separate the Meiser Sheni, and he can designate its location and deconsecrate it immediately. And with Demai, he can do this even before he identifies the Meiser Rishon. So there's some differences here between the two parts of the Mishnah. I just want to point that out. Now, the Gemara is going to move forward and start to look at the Mishnah's first case, where the person is going to talk about where he says, separate tomorrow. And again, we're not talking about the Bavli version, as the Vilna Goan is pointing out. We're talking about the Yerushalmi version. And since the Truma and Meiser will not be separated on the Shabbat, it's unclear when they are to take effect. And the Gemara is going to clarify that. In other words, in this question, the Gemara does not yet recognize that the Mishnah is relying on Breira. And again, that's the key point. This is all relying on Breira in order to do it. And with the definite Tevel, if you're saying that you live in a world where there is no Breira, then on something that's definite Tevel, you can't do this process. And if you are living in a world that you say, okay, there is Breira, and now I have Tevel, I'm not dealing with Demai, I'm dealing with Tevel, here's how you do it. So the Gemara says, how is this designation made? In other words, what it's asking is, when exactly is he going to declare the Truma and the Meiser designation to actually take effect? And if you would say, oh, it would take effect immediately, then a pile of produce becomes a mixture of Truma and non-Truma. And when he eats from the produce on Shabbat, he might be consuming Truma. And you're not allowed to do that if you're not a Goan. If you're a Goan, you can do it. If you're not a Goan, you can't do it. So, on the other hand, if the ties are not to take effect until after he's eaten, then when he eats the food, it's still going to be Tevel, and you're not allowed to eat the Tevel. So they're asking a question. They're saying, how is this to actually be made? Because the Gemara is really trying to figure out that, well, maybe inevitably you're consuming some of the Truma. Going to be like while you're eating it, it's going to be Tevel. And the only way you can get around this is with Breira. That's where it's leading to, right? Because if you sit down, you make this designation before Shabbat. You sit down, you eat these figs, and you're going to say, okay, well, there's no Breira. Fine. You eat the figs. You ate Tevel because you didn't physically separate out the tithes yet. So now what? So if you're going to say, oh, well, there's Breira, and all I'm doing is identifying it after the fact, and it's going to be like it was rectified in the beginning, then you didn't eat the Tevel because Breira fixes it. So the Gemara is going to answer this. And going to say that he says that the Truma and the Meiser shall take effect already when I separate it. That's going to be the key clause. In other words, each tithe is going to be effective immediately in this pre-tithing process before you start doing it. And it's only going to be identified when he's actually separating it. In other words, that you're going to have the specific portion that's eventually going to be separated. And when you separate it out, that's going to become Truma and Meiser from that moment. And because you're saying there's Breira, that person didn't eat Tevel since the tithes are designated. And then the food retroactively becomes rectified. And where does it become rectified? It goes back to the point of stipulation. It says basically from the point of when you made this declaration. So there's not going to be a mixture of Truma and Hulin because the portion that you're designated as Truma is going to be separated after Shabbat, and whatever he eats during Shabbat is going to be actual Hulin. And you can rely on all of this based on Breira. This all is using Breira, and it's going to allow the designation to take effect retroactively and immediately, and it becomes clarified and fixed once you end the process by physically taking out the Truma at the end of this process, and that's when it becomes fixed from this first designation. So by doing that, you can go ahead and eat. Now, this only works if you're believing there's Breira. Now, again, Rebbe doesn't hold there's Breira. So having explained that the designation takes effective immediately and it's going to be retroactively clarified and fixed later on, the Gemara is going to present several ways of wording this designation, and it's going to basically be talking about these unique circumstances. And the Gemara says, think about it. If the produce was tahor, such that the portion that would eventually be separated would be tahor truma, then he should say that the truma shall take effect already, in other words, immediately, and be identified when I've eaten the remaining produce. And the idea here, says Rabbi Kanievsky, is that the portion that he's leaving over when he's finishing to eat is going to be retroactively identified as the truma portion. And Rabbi Kanievsky points out that since the tahor truma is fit for a Kohen, and he's allowed to eat it, right? That's the portion the Kohens get anyway. And therefore, it's not going to be muksa, and you're going to be allowed to move it. And one is able to make that designation in this way if you believe in Breira. And Rabbi Kanievsky is going to be basing his commentary about this on the Vilna Goan, and Rabbi Kanievsky is going to be saying that the effect of designating by saying that which I will leave over is that as soon as you're finished eating and something is left over, and again, we saw that one of the worries in chapter 7, Halacha 4, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's worry is that you eat all of it, and then retroactively through Breira, you ate Tevel. Rabbi Kanievsky over here is pointing out that something is left over, and we're dealing with the leftover portion, and that leftover portion is considered truma. So basically, what Rabbi Kanievsky is pointing out about this is that during Shabbat, you ate chulin, and you stopped to eat, and what's going to be left over is going to be the truma. And then at the end of Shabbat, you're going to say, this is the truma. So presumably, says Rabbi Kanievsky, the truma portion will need to be moved somewhere else for storage, so it can later be given to a Kohen. And in a case of tahor truma, you're allowed to do it since tahor truma is not muksa. So one will be able to move the truma portion on the Shabbat. Now we're going to get into the next case. Okay, the next case is going to be temei truma. So the Gemara says, think about it. And it says, if the produce was temei, such that the portion would eventually be separated, that would be taken out, would be temei truma, then he should say the truma shall take effect already, in other words, immediately, and shall be identified when I've placed it in a corner after I finished eating. In other words, what he's saying is that even after he's eaten all the other produce, the remaining portion shall not be identified as truma retroactively until it's already been stored away. So in other words, all he's doing is he's moving chulin mixed in with truma, which you're allowed to do on Shabbat. You finish eating it, and you stop. But what did you do when you finished eating it? You put it in the storage area. Now it's in the storage area. Why? Because the temei truma is going to be muksa. And basically by postponing this identification until you put it away, you're not moving muksa on Shabbat. The Gemara now is going to look at a case where somebody stipulated the ties on Shabbos, and in this case, one does not intend for the ties to take effect retroactively. Rather, they're going to become effective on Shabbat when they're actually separated. And until the ties are separated, the produce is still tevel. So the Gemara is going to be really asking whether it's going to be considered muksa at this time or not. And the Gemara is going to say, it was taught in a Brisa, if one stipulated regarding his tevel that he would stipulate or separate his tithes on Shabbat, and then even before separating them, he may move the produce, and whether it is tahor and the truma portion that contained it is going to have a tahor truma inside, or if it's going to be temei and the truma portion that's contained in it is going to be temei truma. Now, the reason, says Rabbi Kanievsky, that ordinary tevel is muksa is that it's completely unfit for use on Shabbos, and you can't eat it, and you can't rectify it on that day. And in this case, since the virtue of this advanced stipulation, the question is going to be that, is the tevel going to be fit to be rectified and then consumed on the Shabbos itself? And, then is it going to be muksa or not? That's really what it's asking. So ordinarily, tevel is muksa. And the Gemara is going to explain why in this case the produce is not muksa even before the truma portion is separated. In other words, this is trying to dig in and ask, what is the nature of this verbal declaration that you're making before Shabbat, before you're going to separate tithes. So now on Shabbat, you're moving all of this. You didn't take out the truma yet. Is it muktzah or not? Rabbi Zera says in this Gemara that this Breira in effect says that Tevel that has upon it an advanced tithing stipulation, which allows the tithes to be separated on Shabbat, is permitted to be moved on Shabbos. Since why? The basis of the advanced stipulation is going to be where it's potentially fit for consumption on Shabbat. And this idea of making it potentially fit is going to make sure that it's not muktzah. The Gemara is now going to describe the procedure for someone who cannot actually separate the tithes on Shabbos. The Gemara asks and says, what does one do in a situation where he's unable to physically separate the tithes on Shabbos? And the Gemara says that he directs his eye toward a part of the pile of produce and mentally designates that part as truma and meiser, and then he may eat from the rectified remainder of the produce. So the Marafuld is going to explain that this mental separation of tithes is valid. And the Gemara is teaching that in a case where one is not physically allowed to separate the tithes on Shabbos, he's still allowed to make a mental separation and then eat from the remaining portion. And after Shabbat, he's going to physically separate the portion that's mentally set aside on Shabbos. And so basically what this is talking about, according to the Rambam, is that one who makes a pre-Shabbos maestro stipulation is required to repeat that stipulation on Shabbat when he actually separates the tithes. And this is true even if he performs only a mental separation of the tithes on Shabbos, and he's required to accompany it with the repetition of this verbal statement. So that's going to sum this up, and Halacha 6 is going to get into, it's going to be a little bit long, but it's going to get into some intricacies in Trumos and how we're going to designate Trumos and Meiseros when you're going to have two sets of piles. Have a great day.